I never thought I would become the guy who declared war on a homeowners association. But here I am, standing in front of my creek property with a bulldozer operator on speed dial and a lawyer who specializes in easement disputes. My name is Trevor Jackson, and I have lived in Riverside Meadows, North Carolina for the past 8 years. The subdivision sits along a beautiful stretch of Willow Creek, which winds through the entire neighborhood before connecting to the Tar River about 3 miles downstream. When I bought my property back in 2018, the main selling point was not the house itself, but the 2 acres of creek frontage that came with it. The realtor had shown me the pristine water, the willow trees hanging over the banks, and the wildlife that called it home. I signed the papers within a week. What the realtor failed to mention was that the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association was run by a woman named Patricia Whitmore, a 52-year-old former real estate attorney who treated the HOA presidency like it was a Supreme Court appointment. Patricia had short blonde hair that she kept in that classic "I want to speak to the manager" style, and she drove a white Lexus SUV with a custom license plate that read HOPRES. I should have known better from day one. For the first few years, I kept my head down and followed the rules. I painted my house the approved shade of beige. I kept my grass at exactly 2.5 inches, and I made sure my mailbox matched the neighborhood standard. But everything changed in the spring of 2023 when I started volunteering at the Carolina Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Raleigh. That is where I met Dr. Sarah Chen, a veterinarian who specialized in reptile rescue and rehabilitation. One Saturday morning, Sarah called me about 3 eastern box turtles that had been surrendered by their owner. The guy had kept them in a tiny tank for years, and they were severely malnourished with shell rot and vitamin deficiencies. Sarah knew about my creek property and asked if I would be willing to provide a natural habitat for them once they recovered. Box turtles are native to North Carolina, and my creek would be perfect for their rehabilitation before eventual release back into the wild. I said yes immediately. Within 2 months, I had built a proper outdoor enclosure along the creek bank, complete with shallow pools, basking areas, native plants, and proper fencing to keep predators out while allowing the turtles to experience a natural environment. The enclosure was about 30 feet by 40 feet, and it sat entirely on my property, at least 15 feet from my property line. I named the 3 turtles Mo, Larry, and Curly because apparently I am terrible at naming animals. The turtles thrived. By July, their shells had healed. They had gained healthy weight, and they spent their days doing exactly what box turtles are supposed to do: foraging for insects, soaking in the creek water, and basking in the Carolina sun. Sarah came by monthly to check on them and was thrilled with their progress. She told me that by spring 2024, they would probably be ready for release into a protected wildlife area. Everything was perfect until August 15, 2023, when Patricia Whitmore showed up at my door with her clipboard and her pursed lips. I was in my garage working on my truck when I heard the clicking of heels on my driveway. I looked up to see Patricia standing there in white capri pants and a pink polo shirt with the Riverside Meadows logo embroidered on the chest. "Trevor," she said in that tight voice she used when she was about to ruin someone's day, "we need to discuss your unauthorized creek modification." I wiped the grease off my hands with a shop rag and walked over. "What creek modification?" She pulled a photograph from her clipboard and showed it to me. It was a picture of my turtle enclosure taken from what looked like the Hendersons' property next door. "This structure," she said, tapping the photo with a manicured fingernail. "It was never approved by the Architectural Review Committee. According to Section 7.3 of the HOA covenants, Any structure visible from neighboring properties or common areas requires written approval before construction. I felt my jaw tighten. That is not a structure. It is a wildlife rehabilitation enclosure, and it sits entirely on my property. I checked the setback requirements before I built it. Regardless of what you call it, it is an unapproved addition to your property, Patricia said. I am going to need you to submit plans for review, along with a $250 application fee. Until it is approved, you will need to remove it. Remove it. I have 3 rescue turtles living in there. Patricia's expression did not change. That is another issue we need to discuss. Section 12.1 prohibits residents from keeping livestock or exotic animals on their property. Turtles fall under that category. I actually laughed. Turtles are not livestock. They are native wildlife. Eastern box turtles are indigenous to North Carolina. I am providing rehabilitation for injured animals under the guidance of a licensed wildlife veterinarian. Then I suggest you find another location for your hobby, Patricia said. You have 30 days to comply with the removal order, or the HOA will begin assessing daily fines of $50. Good day, Trevor. She turned and walked back to her Lexus before I could respond. I stood there in my driveway, holding a greasy shop rag, trying to process what had just happened. Patricia Whitmore had just ordered me to get rid of 3 recovering rescue turtles because she did not like the look of their enclosure. I spent the next week researching HOA law and reading through every page of the Riverside Meadows covenants. What I found was that Patricia was technically correct about the structure approval requirement, but she was completely wrong about the exotic animal clause. The covenant specifically mentioned livestock, which was defined as domesticated animals raised for agricultural purposes, including but not limited to cattle, pigs, goats, sheep, and chickens. There was no mention of wildlife rehabilitation, and turtles were absolutely not exotic animals in North Carolina. I wrote a detailed response letter citing the specific covenant language and including documentation from the Carolina Wildlife Rehabilitation Center explaining the nature of the turtle rehabilitation project. I sent it certified mail to the HOA office and waited. Patricia's response came 10 days later. She had forwarded my letter to the HOA attorney, who had issued a formal opinion stating that the covenant's intent was to prohibit any animal keeping beyond typical household pets, such as dogs and cats. The attorney claimed that 3 turtles living in a creekside enclosure constituted animal keeping and therefore violated the spirit of the covenant. The removal order stood, and the 30-day deadline was now in effect. I was furious. The spirit of the covenant was lawyer talk for we are going to interpret this however we want. I called Sarah at the Wildlife Center, and she was equally outraged. She offered to write a letter explaining the conservation importance of the rehabilitation work, but I knew it would not matter. Patricia had made up her mind. On September 20, 2023, I received my first fine notice, $50 per day, retroactive to September 16. The notice informed me that the HOA had the right to place a lien on my property if the fines were not paid within 90 days. I was now apparently in debt to my own neighborhood association for the crime of helping 3 injured turtles. That night, I sat on my back porch with a beer and stared at the creek. The sun was setting, and I could see Mo making his way toward the water for an evening soak. Larry was already submerged, just his head poking above the surface. Curly was digging in the soft earth near the willow tree, probably looking for earthworms. They were doing exactly what healthy turtles should do, and Patricia Whitmore wanted me to destroy that because it was not aesthetically pleasing enough for Riverside Meadows. That is when I noticed something interesting. About 200 yards upstream from my property, there was a small wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The bridge was the only access point for the eastern half of the subdivision to reach the community dock and boat launch area on the west side. Without that bridge, residents from at least 40 homes would have to drive completely around the neighborhood, adding about 2 miles to their trip, just to access the water amenities that they paid association fees to maintain. I pulled up the county GIS mapping system on my phone and started tracing property lines. The creek itself was technically not owned by anyone. It was a natural waterway, but the land on both sides definitely had owners. I zoomed in on the bridge location and felt my heart rate increase. The western support pillar of that bridge sat squarely on my property. Not on HOA common area, not on an easement, on my actual deeded property. I went inside and pulled out my property survey from the closing documents. I spread it across my kitchen table and traced the boundary lines with my finger. Sure enough, my property extended further north along the creek than I had realized. The survey clearly showed my property line, and the bridge footing was at least 6 feet inside my boundary. The next morning, I drove to the Wake County Register of Deeds office in Raleigh. I requested copies of all easement documents and right-of-way agreements associated with my property address. The clerk printed out everything on file, which amounted to a stack of papers about half an inch thick. I sat in the parking lot and read through every page. There was a utility easement for the water and sewer lines. There was a drainage easement for stormwater management. There was even a conservation easement protecting the creek buffer zone from development. But there was absolutely no recorded easement granting the HOA, or anyone else the right, to maintain a bridge on my property. Someone had built that bridge years ago, probably assuming they had permission or assuming the land was part of the common area, but they had never actually secured the legal right to do so. I drove home with a plan forming in my head. If Patricia wanted to play hardball with rules and covenants, I could play that game too. I just needed to find the right lawyer. The next day, I met with Robert McAllister, an attorney in Durham who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. Robert was in his mid-40s, with graying hair and the tired eyes of a man who had seen too many neighborhood feuds turn nuclear. I explained the situation with the turtles, showed him the fine notices, and then laid out my discovery about the bridge. Robert leaned back in his chair and whistled softly. So the HOA has been using your property for access without an easement, and now they are fining you for a wildlife rehabilitation enclosure that is fully compliant with county regulations. That is about the size of it, I said. How much are you willing to spend on this fight? Robert asked. Enough to make a point, I said. I am not moving those turtles and I am not paying Patricia Whitmore a single dollar in fines. Robert smiled. Then let me draft a letter explaining to the HOA that they are currently trespassing on your property with their bridge structure. We will give them 30 days to either negotiate an easement agreement or remove the bridge entirely. If they want to fight about your turtle enclosure, we will fight about their bridge. The letter went out on October 2, 2023. I hand-delivered a copy to Patricia's house just to see the look on her face. She answered the door in a bathrobe, and I could hear a talk show playing on her television in the background. "What is this?" she asked, looking at the envelope. "Legal notice regarding the bridge on my property," I said. "You might want to read it carefully." I walked back to my truck before she could respond, but I watched in my rearview mirror as she tore open the envelope. Even from a distance, I could see her face turn red. The next HOA board meeting was on October 10, and I made sure to attend. The meetings were held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that also housed a gym and a pool. About 30 residents were scattered across the folding chairs when I arrived. Patricia sat at the head table with the other board members, including Vice President Gerald Morrison, Secretary Linda Chen, and Treasurer Bob Andrews. Patricia called the meeting to order and worked through the usual agenda items: landscaping updates, pool maintenance schedules, and a complaint about someone parking an RV on their driveway. Then she got to the agenda item labeled Legal Matter Regarding Creek Access. As many of you know, Patricia began, we have received a notice from one of our residents claiming that the creek bridge is built on private property. The board has consulted with our attorney, and we are currently reviewing the title documents to verify the claim. In the meantime, we want to assure everyone that creek access will remain open and available. I raised my hand. Patricia pointedly ignored me and tried to move on to the next agenda item, but I stood up anyway. Trevor Jackson, 412 Willow Creek Drive, I said loudly. Since I am the resident who sent the notice, I would like to clarify a few things for everyone here. Patricia's lips became a thin line. This is not the appropriate forum for individual disputes. Really. Because you made my turtle rehabilitation project a community issue when you started fining me $50 a day. So let me explain what is happening. The HOA ordered me to remove a wildlife rehabilitation enclosure from my property and began assessing daily fines, claiming I violated the covenants. Meanwhile, the HOA has been operating a bridge on my property for years without any legal easement or permission. My attorney has given the HOA 30 days to either negotiate a proper easement or remove the bridge. You could hear the murmurs ripple through the room. Several residents pulled out their phones and started typing. Gerald Morrison leaned over and whispered something to Patricia. The bridge serves the entire community, Patricia said. Surely you are not going to deny your neighbors access to the creek amenities over a personal grudge. I am not denying anyone anything, I said. I am asking the HOA to follow the same rules and regulations that you demand everyone else follow. If my turtle enclosure needs approval, then your bridge needs an easement. It is that simple. Those turtles are a nuisance and a violation of our covenants, Patricia snapped. No, they are not. I have documentation from a licensed wildlife veterinarian stating that this is a legitimate rehabilitation project for native wildlife. Eastern box turtles are not exotic animals, and they are not livestock. Your attorney is misinterpreting the covenant to suit your personal preferences. Linda Chen raised her hand tentatively. Can I ask what kind of turtles we are talking about? Like snapping turtles? Eastern box turtles, I said. They are about the size of your hand, they eat bugs and plants, and they are completely harmless. They were surrendered to a wildlife rehabilitation center because their previous owner kept them in inhumane conditions. They are recovering on my property before being released into a protected habitat. This is conservation work, not a pet project. Bob Andrews shuffled some papers. How much would it cost to establish an easement for the bridge? That would depend on the negotiation, I said. But I am willing to discuss reasonable terms. All I want is for the HOA to drop the fines and leave my rehabilitation project alone. If you can do that, we can work something out for the bridge. Patricia stood up abruptly. This board does not negotiate with residents who hold the community hostage. Meeting adjourned. She grabbed her papers and walked out of the community center. The other board members looked at each other uncomfortably, and Gerald Morrison finally dismissed everyone. As people filed out, several neighbors came up to me and asked about the turtles. A few of them had actually noticed the enclosure and thought it was cool. One woman, Jennifer Hayes from down the street, told me her kids would love to see the turtles and asked if I ever did educational visits. Anytime, I said. This is exactly why I am doing this. These turtles deserve a second chance. Over the next 2 weeks, I got to know my neighbors better than I had in 8 years of living in Riverside Meadows. People stopped by to see the turtles, brought their kids for impromptu nature lessons, and asked questions about wildlife rehabilitation. Sarah came by and gave a short presentation to a group of about 15 neighbors about the importance of native turtle conservation. It turned out that a lot of people in the neighborhood actually cared about wildlife and thought the HOA was being ridiculous. But Patricia was not backing down. On October 24, I received a notice that my accumulated fines now totaled $2,000. And the HOA was prepared to file a lien against my property. The notice also stated that the bridge easement was being reviewed by the HOA attorney, but that the bridge would remain open regardless of my unfounded legal threats. I forwarded the notice to Robert McAllister, and he immediately drafted a formal cease and desist letter demanding that the HOA stop using my property for the bridge. The letter included a deadline of November 15, 2023. If the HOA did not respond with a reasonable easement proposal by that date, I would be within my rights to physically block access to the bridge or remove the portion that sat on my property. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Robert asked me when I approved the letter. "Once you actually block that bridge, things are going to get ugly." "They are already ugly," I said. "Patricia made it ugly when she went after 3 rescue turtles. I am just returning the favor." The letter went out on October 26. On October 30, I received a response from the HOA attorney, Marcus Delgado. The letter was 5 pages of legal jargon, but the basic message was clear. The HOA claimed an implied easement based on years of continuous use, and they believed they would prevail in court if I attempted to block access. They were not interested in negotiating. Implied easement, Robert explained when I called him, is a legal doctrine that can sometimes grant property rights based on long-term use. But it is a high bar to meet, especially when there is no evidence that the original property owners intended to grant access. Your property survey is clear, and there is no recorded easement. They are bluffing. So what do? We call their bluff. On November 16, if they have not presented a reasonable easement offer, you have every legal right to restrict access to your property. I recommend installing a fence or gate that clearly marks your property line and blocks access to that bridge footing. They can either negotiate with you, or they can spend a lot of money in court trying to establish an easement they probably cannot win. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing. I hired a surveyor to come out and mark the exact property boundaries with bright orange stakes. I contacted a fencing company about installing a heavy-duty gate across the creek access point. And I documented everything. Every fine notice from the HOA, every piece of correspondence, every photograph of the healthy turtles living in their enclosure. On November 14, I received one final communication from Patricia Whitmore. It was a handwritten note slipped into my mailbox. "Remove the turtles and this all goes away. Keep pushing and you will regret it." I took a picture of the note and sent it to Robert. "Is this a threat?" "It is poorly worded and unprofessional," Robert replied, "but not quite actionable. Just keep it for your records." November 15 came and went with no easement offer from the HOA. On the morning of November 16, the fencing company arrived at my property with a truck full of materials. By noon, We had installed a 6-foot-tall aluminum gate directly across the path leading to the creek bridge. The gate sat exactly on my property line, as verified by the survey stakes. A sign on the gate read, "Private property. No trespassing. Bridge access denied due to lack of easement agreement." I posted a notice on the Riverside Meadows community Facebook page explaining what I had done and why. Within an hour, the post had over 100 comments. Some people were furious, claiming I was being petty and vindictive. Others supported me, pointing out that the HOA had started this fight by going after my turtle rehabilitation project. One guy named Mark Sullivan, who lived on the eastern side of the neighborhood, posted, "So now I have to drive 2 extra miles every time I want to launch my kayak because Patricia Whitmore hates turtles. This is insane." By evening, my phone was blowing up with text messages and missed calls. I ignored most of them, but I did respond to Jennifer Hayes when she texted, "Good for you. Patricia has been a tyrant for years. Maybe this will finally get the board to replace her." The next morning, I woke up to find Patricia Whitmore standing at my gate with bolt cutters. I watched from my kitchen window as she positioned the cutters around the gate lock. I grabbed my phone, started recording video, and walked outside. "I would not do that if I were you," I called out. Patricia jumped and spun around. "This gate is blocking community access. I am removing it as an HOA officer. That gate is on my private property, and you are currently trespassing. If you cut that lock, I will call the sheriff and have you arrested for vandalism and trespassing." "You cannot block community amenities," Patricia said, her face flushed red. "I am not blocking anything. I am restricting access to my private property, which I have every legal right to do. The HOA never secured an easement for that bridge. You have been trespassing for years." "This is ridiculous," Patricia said. "Those stupid turtles are not worth all this trouble." "Then drop the fines and leave my rehabilitation project alone. I already told you my terms." Patricia stood there gripping the bolt cutters, clearly torn between her desire to cut the gate and her understanding that I was recording everything. Finally, she threw the bolt cutters on the ground. "The board will be filing a lawsuit against you for interfering with community access. You will lose, and you will pay for all of it." She stormed back to her Lexus and peeled out of my driveway, leaving the bolt cutters lying in the grass. I picked them up and put them in my garage, keeping the video evidence safely stored on my phone and backed up to the cloud. That afternoon, I got a call from Gerald Morrison, the HOA vice president. Gerald was a reasonable guy, a retired accountant who had lived in Riverside Meadows for 20 years. He sounded exhausted. "Trevor, we need to find a solution here," he said. "Half the neighborhood is up in arms about the bridge closure." "I have been offering a solution since October," I said. "Drop the fines for my turtle enclosure, and I will grant an easement for the bridge. It is that simple. Patricia is convinced you are violating the covenants. Patricia is wrong. I have documentation from a wildlife veterinarian and legal analysis from my attorney. Those turtles are not a covenant violation. She just does not like that I did something without asking her permission first." Gerald sighed. "Let me talk to the board. Give me a few days to see if I can get Patricia to see reason." "You have until the end of November," I said. "After that, my attorney files a trespassing lawsuit and seeks damages for every day the HOA has used my property without compensation. Right now, I am willing to settle this reasonably, but if this drags into December, the price goes up." I could hear Gerald rubbing his forehead through the phone. "I will see what I can do." Over the next week, the Riverside Meadows community descended into chaos. Residents on the eastern side of the neighborhood were furious about the bridge closure and started a petition to recall Patricia from the board. Residents who supported my turtle project created a counter-petition demanding that the HOA drop all fines and apologize. The community Facebook page became a war zone of arguments and accusations. On November 28, the HOA called an emergency board meeting to address the bridge situation. Over 100 residents showed up, packing the community center beyond capacity. People stood along the walls and spilled out into the hallway. Patricia sat at the head table looking like she had not slept in days. Gerald Morrison opened the meeting. "We are here tonight to discuss the Creek Bridge access situation and hopefully reach a resolution that serves the entire community. As you all know, resident Trevor Jackson has blocked access to the bridge due to a dispute regarding his property boundaries and an ongoing fine assessment. The board has been reviewing all relevant documents and consulting with our attorney." A man in the back shouted, "So let him keep his turtles and open the bridge back up." Several people applauded. Patricia banged a gavel on the table. "Order, let the board speak." Bob Andrews, the treasurer, cleared his throat. "After reviewing the property surveys and title documents, it appears that Mr. Jackson is correct about the property boundaries. The western bridge support does sit on his property, and there is no recorded easement granting the HOA access. Legally speaking, he has the right to restrict access." The room erupted in angry shouting. Someone yelled, "Then negotiate with him." Someone else yelled, "This is Patricia's fault for going after his turtles." Patricia banged the gavel again. "The issue with the turtles is separate from the bridge access. Mr. Jackson violated HOA covenants by constructing an unapproved structure and keeping unauthorized animals on his property." I stood up. "No, I did not, and I have legal documentation proving it. But let me make this easy for everyone. I will grant a permanent easement for the bridge, at no cost to the HOA, if the board agrees to the following terms. All fines related to my turtle rehabilitation project are dismissed and removed from my account. The HOA acknowledges in writing that native wildlife rehabilitation is not a covenant violation, and Patricia Whitmore issues a formal apology for harassment and abuse of her position as HOA president." The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at Patricia. Her face was the color of a ripe tomato. "I will not apologize for enforcing community standards," Patricia said. "Then the bridge stays closed," I said. "Your choice." Gerald Morrison leaned over and whispered urgently to Patricia. Linda Chen joined the conversation, and I could see Bob Andrews nodding along. They huddled at the head table for several minutes while the crowd waited. Finally, Gerald sat back and spoke into the microphone. "The board would like to propose a compromise. We will dismiss all fines related to the turtle enclosure and acknowledge that wildlife rehabilitation is permitted under the covenants. In exchange, Mr. Jackson grants an easement for the bridge and removes the gate within 48 hours. "And the apology?" I asked. Gerald looked at Patricia, who crossed her arms and stared straight ahead. "The board apologizes for any miscommunication or overreach regarding the turtle project." "Not good enough," I said. "Patricia personally targeted me and my rehabilitation work because she did not like it. She sent threatening notes to my mailbox. She showed up at my property with bolt cutters to vandalize my gate. A generic board apology does not cut it. She apologizes personally, or the bridge stays closed." The crowd started murmuring again, and I could feel the momentum shifting in my direction. Even the people who were angry about the bridge closure seemed to recognize that Patricia had gone too far. Linda Chen spoke up. "Patricia, just apologize. This has gone on long enough." "I will not be bullied," Patricia said. "You are the one who has been bullying Trevor," someone shouted from the crowd. Patricia stood up abruptly. knocking her chair over backward. "Fine. I apologize for enforcing the rules and trying to maintain property values in this community. Is everyone happy now?" "That is not an apology," I said. "That is sarcasm wrapped in passive-aggressive nonsense." Gerald Morrison put his face in his hands. The room was tense enough to vibrate. Finally, a woman I did not recognize stood up near the front. She was older, maybe 70, with white hair and a cardigan sweater. "My name is Dorothy Palmer," she said. "I have lived in this neighborhood for 32 years, since before there was even an HOA. I have watched Patricia Whitmore turn this community into her personal fiefdom, fining people for nonsense, rejecting reasonable requests out of spite, and generally making everyone miserable. Trevor's turtle project is lovely. I have been down to see it, and those animals are being cared for beautifully. Patricia went after him because he did not ask her permission first, and her ego could not handle it. If she cannot offer a genuine apology, then I am calling for her resignation from the board effective immediately." The room erupted in applause. Dorothy remained standing, and several other people stood up with her. Within seconds, half the room was on their feet clapping. Patricia's face went from red to white. She grabbed her purse and her clipboard and walked out of the community center without another word. The remaining board members sat at the table looking shell-shocked. Gerald Morrison eventually called for order and reconvened the meeting. "In light of the board president's departure, I am assuming temporary leadership of this meeting. I would like to formally propose that all fines assessed against Trevor Jackson for the Turtle Rehabilitation Project be dismissed and removed from HOA records. All in favor?" Linda Chen and Bob Andrews both raised their hands immediately. "Motion passes unanimously," Gerald said. "Mr. Jackson, will you accept that resolution and grant the easement for the bridge?" I thought about it for a moment. I want it in writing, with the full board signatures, acknowledging that native wildlife rehabilitation is permitted on private property within Riverside Meadows. And I want a formal letter from the HOA attorney withdrawing the exotic animal claim. Once I have those documents, I will work with my attorney to draft a proper easement agreement." "That is acceptable," Gerald said. "We will have the documents prepared within 1 week." "Then we have a deal," I said. The room burst into applause again, and several neighbors came over to shake my hand as the meeting broke up. Jennifer Hayes gave me a hug and told me her kids wanted to come see the turtles again this weekend. Mark Sullivan, the kayaker, bought me a beer at the local bar later that night and told me I had done the whole neighborhood a favor by standing up to Patricia. The documents arrived on December 4, exactly as promised. The HOA formally withdrew all fines and issued a written acknowledgement that wildlife rehabilitation was permitted under the community covenants. My attorney reviewed everything and drafted an easement agreement granting the HOA permanent access to the bridge location in exchange for $1 and the dismissal of all claims. We recorded the easement with the county on December 8, and I removed the gate that afternoon. But the story did not end there. In January 2024, Patricia Whitmore resigned from the HOA board entirely. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that several residents had threatened to file harassment complaints with the county if she did not step down. Gerald Morrison became the new president, and one of his first acts was to reform the architectural review process to make it more transparent and reasonable. The turtles continued to thrive. Mo, Larry, and Curly spent the winter in a climate-controlled indoor habitat I built in my garage, then returned to the outdoor enclosure in March 2024 when the weather warmed up. Sarah visited in April and declared them fully rehabilitated and ready for release. On a Saturday morning in May, I loaded the 3 turtles into a carrier and drove them to a protected conservation area about 40 miles away. Sarah met me there with a wildlife biologist from the state, and we released all 3 turtles into a pristine forest habitat with a spring-fed stream. Watching those turtles walk slowly into their new home, exploring the leaf litter and disappearing into the underbrush, was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. They had gone from sick and malnourished captives to healthy wild animals, and they had done it in spite of Patricia Whitmore and the Riverside Meadows HOA. But I was not done with wildlife rehabilitation. In June 2024, Sarah called me about a juvenile snapping turtle that had been hit by a car. Then it was a wood turtle with a respiratory infection. Then 3 more box turtles from a hoarding situation. My creek property became an unofficial rehabilitation site for injured and surrendered turtles across the region. I expanded the enclosure, added more naturalistic features, and started documenting everything for educational purposes. In August 2024, Jennifer Hayes approached me about starting an official nonprofit focused on native turtle conservation and education. She had a background in nonprofit management and knew how to handle the paperwork and fundraising. I agreed, and by October we had established the Willow Creek Turtle Sanctuary as a registered 501(c)(3) organization. The sanctuary was based on my property, but now it had legal protections and tax-exempt status. We started hosting educational events for school groups and families, teaching people about the importance of native turtle species and the threats they faced from habitat loss, road mortality, and the illegal pet trade. The HOA, now under Gerald's reasonable leadership, had no objections. In fact, the sanctuary became a point of pride for Riverside Meadows. The neighborhood website featured photos of the turtles, and several residents volunteered to help with maintenance and educational programs. In December 2024, I got an unexpected phone call from Patricia Whitmore. I almost did not answer when I saw her name on the caller ID, but curiosity got the better of me. "Trevor, this is Patricia," she said stiffly. "I am calling to apologize." I sat down on my couch, genuinely surprised. "Okay. I was wrong about your turtle project," she continued. "I let my ego get in the way of common sense, and I treated you poorly. I have been doing some reflecting over the past year, and I realized that I turned the HOA into something toxic. I am sorry for the way I handled things." "I appreciate that," I said. "That took courage to call." "I heard about the nonprofit you started," Patricia said. "It sounds like you are doing good work. If you ever need a volunteer, I have a lot of free time now." I was not sure what to say to that. The idea of Patricia Whitmore volunteering at my turtle sanctuary seemed surreal. But people could change, and her apology sounded genuine. "Let me talk to Jennifer," I said. "We always need help with administrative work. I will give you a call after the holidays." "Thank you, Trevor, and congratulations on everything you have built." She hung up, and I sat there staring at my phone. The world was a strange place sometimes. In January 2025, Patricia started volunteering at the sanctuary 2 days a week. She handled paperwork, answered emails, and helped organize our educational materials. She never complained, never tried to take over, and actually turned out to be pretty good with kids during school visits. Jennifer told me privately that having Patricia involved was probably the best possible outcome, because it showed that even the biggest critic of the sanctuary had come around to support it. By February 2025, the Willow Creek Turtle Sanctuary was hosting over 200 visitors a month. We had rehabilitated and released 17 turtles since opening, and we had 3 permanent residents who could not be released, due to permanent injuries. I named them governors because they would be living at the sanctuary for the rest of their lives. The sanctuary also started offering training workshops for people interested in wildlife rehabilitation. Sarah taught classes on reptile medicine and handling techniques. I taught classes on habitat construction and animal behavior. We partnered with the Carolina Wildlife Rehabilitation Center to create a pipeline for injured turtles to receive care. And we worked with the State Wildlife Commission to monitor turtle populations in the region. The whole experience taught me something important. Sometimes standing up for what is right means going to war with the people who are supposed to be on your side. The HOA was created to protect property values and maintain community standards, but under Patricia's leadership, it had become a weapon for petty control. By fighting back, not just for myself, but for the principle that wildlife conservation mattered more than aesthetic conformity, I had helped shift the entire community's culture. In March 2025, Riverside Meadows held its annual HOA elections. Gerald Morrison ran for re-election as president and won in a landslide. The new board included Jennifer Hayes as secretary and Dorothy Palmer as a board member at large. One of their first acts was to formally amend the HOA covenants to explicitly permit wildlife rehabilitation and conservation projects on private property, with reasonable guidelines to ensure animal welfare and neighbor consideration. I framed a copy of that covenant amendment and hung it in the sanctuary's education building, right next to a photo of Mo, Larry, and Curly on their release day. Every time someone asked about the sanctuary's history, I told them the story of how 3 rescue turtles had taken on an HOA president and won. As spring turned to summer, the sanctuary continued to grow. We received our first major grant from a national conservation organization, which allowed us to hire Jennifer full-time as executive director and bring on a part-time wildlife care specialist. We expanded our educational programming to include summer camps for kids and volunteer training for adults interested in wildlife conservation. In July 2025, a reporter from the Raleigh News and Observer came out to do a feature story on the sanctuary. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition with a photo of me kneeling next to the creek holding a box turtle. The headline read, "From HOA Battle to Conservation Victory: How One Man's Fight for Rescue Turtles Created a Community Sanctuary." The article told the whole story, including Patricia's initial opposition and eventual transformation into a sanctuary volunteer. Patricia was quoted in the article saying, "I was wrong to oppose this project. Trevor showed me that sometimes the things we think are problems are actually opportunities to make our community better." I am grateful he did not give up. The publicity brought even more visitors and donors to the sanctuary. We started getting calls from other HOA communities dealing with similar conflicts over wildlife-friendly landscaping, bird feeders, and other conservation efforts. Jennifer and I started offering consulting services to help residents navigate HOA regulations while protecting wildlife habitat. In September 2025, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission recognized the Willow Creek Turtle Sanctuary as an official conservation partner. We received state permits to hold and rehabilitate native turtle species, and we became a designated education center for reptile conservation. Sarah officially joined our board of directors, bringing her veterinary expertise and connections to the broader wildlife rehabilitation community. By October 2025, the sanctuary had grown beyond anything I had imagined when I first took in 3 sick box turtles 2 years earlier. We had a dedicated staff, hundreds of volunteers, partnerships with state and national conservation organizations, and a steady stream of animals in need of care. The creek enclosure had been expanded and improved with funding from grants and donations, creating a truly world-class rehabilitation facility. But the best part was the impact on the community. Kids who visited the sanctuary went home excited about turtles and nature. Adults who volunteered learned about conservation and wildlife biology. The entire neighborhood of Riverside Meadows had shifted from fighting about covenant violations to celebrating the natural resources that made the community special in the first place. In November 2025, Gerald Morrison announced that the HOA was officially partnering with the sanctuary to restore and protect the creek habitat throughout the entire neighborhood. We received HOA funding to remove invasive plants, stabilize eroding banks, and create wildlife corridors connecting different properties. What had started as a bitter dispute about 3 rescue turtles had evolved into a comprehensive community conservation initiative. I often thought about that moment in August 2023 when Patricia showed up at my door with her clipboard and her demands. At the time, it felt like the end of the world. I was being fined, threatened, and told to get rid of animals that I was trying to help. I could have given in, moved the turtles somewhere else, and avoided the whole fight. But I did not, and that decision changed everything. Standing up for those turtles meant standing up for the principle that some things are more important than arbitrary rules and aesthetic preferences. It meant fighting for the idea that our communities should value conservation, education, and compassion, not just conformity and control. And it meant showing an entire neighborhood that individuals have the power to challenge unjust authority and create positive change. In January 2026, as I write this, the Willow Creek Turtle Sanctuary is preparing for its 3rd year of operation. We have a budget of over $200,000, staff of 5 people, and a volunteer corps of over 50 community members. We have rehabilitated and released 42 turtles, educated over 3,000 visitors, and inspired similar conservation projects in communities across North Carolina. Patricia Whitmore still volunteers every Tuesday and Thursday. She is in charge of our donor database now, and she is surprisingly good at writing thank you letters to supporters. She and I are not exactly friends, but we have developed a mutual respect. She learned that conservation matters, and I learned that even the most difficult people can change if given the opportunity. The 3 turtles that started it all, Mo, Larry, and Curly, are living wild and free somewhere in that protected conservation area. I like to imagine them basking on logs, foraging for beetles, and doing all the things healthy box turtles are supposed to do. They will never know that their rehabilitation journey sparked a battle with an HOA, resulted in a bridge closure, and ultimately created a thriving conservation organization. But I know, and that is enough. The creek still flows through Riverside Meadows, and the bridge still stands on my property with its proper easement. Kids still come to the sanctuary to learn about turtles and why conservation matters. And somewhere in HOA board meetings across America, residents are probably still fighting about arbitrary rules and covenant violations. But in this little corner of North Carolina, things are different now. Here, we decided that wildlife matters more than conformity. We decided that education matters more than aesthetics. We decided that a community is defined not by how well everyone follows the rules, but by how well they care for each other and the natural world around them. All because I refused to move 3 rescue turtles, and I was willing to close a bridge to prove a point. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance create the biggest changes. Sometimes standing up for what is right means blocking access to the water until the people in power remember what really matters. And sometimes, just sometimes, the turtles win.